Yeah. Okay. So just a couple of quick logistics before I say some thank yous and get us started. Folks on the screen, commission members who are joining us, if they can turn their cameras on so that you pop up for us. Those of you that are participating in the meeting and not on the commission, please keep your camera off until you are speaking, if you are speaking. And before we get started, I would love to thank Superintendent Bill Kimball and his team for hosting us.
Most is that our students out of Fairfield make a lot of syrup. And so anytime anyone comes, a quarter syrup is given to guests. So it's award-winning syrup. 2 years ago,
I will not be able to be with you tonight. John Muldoon, who's up there on the platform, our assistant superintendent, will be there hosting. But anything you need, please ask. Travis is around for technical issues.
Thank you so much. And we really appreciate you speaking for myself. All right. Let's start with roll call. We'll do the members of the commission in the room and then those on the screen. Jay, do you want to start? You're up then.
Sure. Jay Nichols, Executive Director of Vermont Principals Association and the appointee to the commission from the VA.
Heather Oliver Olson, I'm the appointee of the Vermont Independent Schools Association.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Castle. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Rural Education Collaborative.
Peter Coleman, appointee from the Vermont House.
I'm Megan Roy, Chair, and here as the former Chair of the Census-Based Funding Advisory Group.
Nicole Nace, I'm a member of the Winooski School District Board of Trustees, and I'm here as the PSBA's appointee.
Hello, Mike McLeod, I'm the superintendent of the Harwood Unified Union School District. I'm here as the appointee of the Vermont Superintendents Association.
Ann Cummings, I am the appointee of the Vermont Senate.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Zoe Saunders, Interim Secretary of Education.
Good afternoon. I'm Craig Bowler, Tax Commissioner.
And I think we have Elizabeth on the screen.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Jennings. I'm the Director of Finance and Operations for Addison Northwest, and I'm here representing the Vermont Association of School Business Officials.
Thank you. And Jennifer?
Hi, good afternoon. Jennifer Deck Samuelson, Vermont State Board of Education.
Great. Thank you. I think that is all of us. Any amendments to the agenda?
Make a motion to approve.
Perfect. On to the next thing. Motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, John. Any discussion or edits? Steve? Hearing none, all those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Carries, the minutes are approved. We will have two opportunities for public comment at today's meeting. The first one will be now, just as a reminder, this is an opportunity for the public to give input to the commission as it does its work. Depending on how many people we have at the beginning. We may need to put time constraints on, so assume about 3 minutes, but we can be flexible if we don't have a long list. And folks exiting public comment will not probably receive a response immediately, but the commission will have your comments as part of the record. So I'll have folks on the screen raise your hand or turn your camera on, and then if there are folks in the building, and we'll just alternate back and forth. I saw a hand on the screen, so I'm going to go to the screen first. Sue Sugowski.
You're on mute, Sue, if you're trying to speak.
Yeah, thank you very much. It took my computer a very long time to turn off of mute. I'm not sure exactly why that happened, and I apologize. Thank you very much. I'm Sue Siglowski. I'm the Executive Director for the Vermont School Boards Association, and I wanted to draw the Commission's attention to a memorandum that was submitted to the Commission. It's in your meeting materials for today. It was submitted by the VSBA, the Vermont Superintendents Association, and VASBO. And I'm not going to read the memo to you, but it stresses the importance of the Commission having current, relevant, and accurate data. We believe that's critical to the completion of the Commission's duties, and that the data the Commission needs is different from the data that is being created for the Listen and Learn tour. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue. Anyone in the room physically? Ken?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. I have my hearing aids turned up. I'm Ken Fredette from Wallingford, Friends of Vermont Public Education. And I wrote a little piece yesterday I call Time is Precious. As Jeff Francis pointed out at the first meeting of this commission, the charge to issue a preliminary report on cost containment measures by this December would be a challenge, to say the least. And even more so to provide clear information to help school districts build their budgets for fiscal year 25. I watched most of the Ed Finance Subcommittee meeting on October 28th, and it was dismaying to see how much time was spent on a report that is not really applicable to our brave little state. I see the Picus report as a square peg that some are trying to hammer into a round hole. And several comments by Dr. Picus himself bear this out. In the interest of time today, I will just hit the high spots, but I provided timestamps of selected quotes from the video in the written form of this testimony. Early on in his presentation, Dr. Picus said the estimate that Vermont is overspending on education by some $400 to $460 million relied in part on an assumption about how much is spent on after-school and summer school programs. He went on to say they also put in a small factor to consider weights for small schools based on weights generated in other places. He said if they had spent more time getting a feel for small schools, they anticipate that the estimate for adequate spending in Vermont would increase. That's at the bottom of page 5 of his report, by the way. He said they just didn't have the amount of time needed to dedicate to it. He said our choice is to rely on current practices in Vermont, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, or go to a model used in other states. He pointed out that the adequacy estimates are a floor, and that choosing to allocate more resources than the estimate is not a bad thing. Welcome centers were not included in the study because those situations are, quote, temporary. They can be funded by the state when the needs go away, so does the funding. Dr. Picus noted that they have had a long relationship with Wyoming and their test scores were high to begin with, but he doesn't know if they've grown a lot since then. Commissioner Mays questioned the apparent 82% decrease in funding for ELL resources that the Picus report recommends, making note of a study released in January of 2024 that was in a Vermont-specific context, the reality we face, and noted how diverse the community in her district of Winooski is. Dr. Picus responded, there is no question that there is something of a disconnect between the two studies. And he added about a minute and a half later, I don't know much about the specific demographics of Winooski. He referred to needs for ELL resources as unique for a short period of time. He purported that districts could vote to provide additional supports for students by increasing their property tax rate based upon their wealth. The first part is true. The based upon their wealth kind of sounds like he's thinking about our old foundation formula. In reference to a special needs student moving a few miles to another district, he conceded, my knowledge of geography in Vermont is not enough to tell you what that community might be. Still referring to providing supports for special needs, he said it is more a state challenge than a local challenge. And quote, I know that gets mixed up in Vermont a little bit. So in closing, I know Governor Scott has hitched his wagon to this report, but I would implore the commission to not spend much more of your valuable time considering information that, in the author's own words, does not apply here. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Pam Reed on the screen, you're next.
Good afternoon. My name is Pam Reed, and I am here as the president of the Vermont Council of Special Education Administrators. I've been an educator in Vermont for 32 years, currently serving as the Director of Support Services for Rutland City Public Schools. I'm going to share with you some of the comments that were written and submitted to the Commission on October 21st. The Vermont Council of Special Ed Administrators has been one of the cornerstones of educational leadership for over 35 years. Our organization has consistently supported special education administrators and leaders, fostering close collaboration with superintendents, the Agency of Education, family support organizations, and various state entities. Our mission is to provide leadership, support, collegiality, and mentoring to all Vermont educators, especially those involved in special education. We take pride in being part of a state that prioritizes the future of all of its children. And with that commitment in mind, we offer the following 6 insights to the Commission's consideration. The first, that special education is an investment that serves as a vital support system, ensuring that children with disabilities can access a free and appropriate public education. When general education fails to meet the needs of these students, special education becomes a required investment. The costs associated with special education directly correlate with the resources required to create accessible classrooms and facilitate educational progress. The Commission should prioritize discussions around accountability in implementing Act 173 and the expectations surrounding universal design for learning as it relates to special education spending. Special education is as expensive as it needs to create access. The higher the level of access to the general education environment, the less expensive special education will be. The second is regarding maintenance of effort. It is crucial for schools across Vermont to maintain both local and state investments in special education by ensuring consistent funding levels year over year. The Commission must recognize that the federal implications of reducing special education spending. Should local education agents cut back on expenditures, we risk losing federal funding due to maintenance effort requirements, a loss we cannot afford, especially given the current challenges in education in Vermont. With regard to governance, VCSEA advocates for effective and efficient governance structures in Vermont that facilitate student access to quality education within reasonable distances from their homes. Class sizes, teacher to student ratios, governance models, and school configurations are all critical areas that warrant further investigation by the Commission. However, changes or standards in any of these areas must carefully be considered through understanding the statewide impact of any recommendation. School infrastructure. Investment in school infrastructure is essential for enhancing educational delivery in Vermont. Achieving cost savings alongside improved educational outcomes requires careful consideration of our aging facilities. While we understand the goals of the Commission, it is important to consider this need when developing your recommendations. Number 5, we're going to talk about cost containment. We urge through a thorough analysis of potential consequences of indiscriminate cost containment measures. Schools have diverse needs and communities face unique challenges. Any cost containment strategies should be scrutinized for their impact to the district, to the impact district by district before implementation. Finally, BCSEA recommends a comprehensive analysis of the state's spending drivers before making any recommendations. This should include a thorough statistical review of budgets and student counts, both before and after applying weighting factors and the Vermont funding formula. This process should be approached with diligence, as understanding the intricacies of cost drivers is crucial to avoid unintended and detrimental outcomes from misguided recommendations. We thank you for your efforts. We look forward to reviewing your recommendations as you progress through this legislative session.
Thank you, Pam. Looking in the room again. Yep, Jake.
So Jay Nichols, Vermont Principal Association, stepping outside of my role in commission. In a comment sent to the commission today, the headmasters of the 4 historic academies stated that at your October 21, 2024 meeting, the Vermont School Boards, the Vermont Superintendents Association, the Vermont Association of School Business Officials, and the Vermont Principals Association put forward proposals that would force school districts to reduce the tuition they pay our schools and then cap annual tuition rates at the average announced tuition rate. The Vermont Principals Association has made no such proposal and would like that reflected in the record. We were not part of that. We did not make that proposal.
Thanks, Jake. No one else in the room? Brian Bloomfield, can you go ahead?
Thank you very much. My name is Brian Bloomfield. I'm the head of school at Linden Institute, and I'm here today to speak on behalf of the 4 historic academies, Burton Academy, LI, St. John's Fair Academy, and Thetford Academy. My colleagues and I submitted a letter to the commission earlier today in response to the discussion this commission is having regarding short-term cost containment, specifically limiting payment of tuition to independent schools to the average announced tuition. I'd ask that you all read that letter, and I'd like to highlight a few key points. We agree that the current trajectory in education spending is unsustainable, and we welcome the discussions we're engaged in with our local communities and with the commission about ways we can tackle those costs while ensuring that a high quality and equitable education remains available to all of our students. Publicly funded students attending independent schools account for 4% of the students statewide, and most of those students attend one of the 4 historic academies, which serve the most rural region across the state where public schools are unavailable. Our schools support students in poverty, those with mental illness, substance abuse, a variety of special education needs, and other challenges. We see alarming trends in literacy rates for students entering into high school. AAT does not reflect the cost of educating students with these complex needs. Holding our tuition to the AAT would result in a 0.2% savings of statewide educational spendings. I'm going to say that again. 0.2% savings of statewide educational spendings. This will have no meaningful impact on education spending or on property taxes, yet it will have a dramatic and disproportionate impact on our ability to meet the needs of serving some of the most vulnerable students in our rural communities. The 4 academies work very hard at cost containment. Just looking at the past 2 years during unprecedented cost inflation and double-digit increases in teacher healthcare, our schools have held tuition increases to an annual average of less than 6%. We're also tackling unsustainable healthcare costs by exiting from VHI. We've identified alternatives that are actually reducing what we spend on teacher healthcare, not just slowing the growth in premiums. And we would encourage the commission to look seriously at this systemic cost, despite how difficult a conversation that might be. I'd also like to remind the commission that our schools are not eligible for, nor do we ask for state construction dollars, and we do not ask our local communities to bond. This is a significant savings to taxpayers in our districts, as well as the state. We are doing our part to contain costs. We're making difficult decisions about healthcare compensation and programming. Our top priority is to bring equitable, high-quality educational opportunities to our rural communities in a fiscally responsible manner. On behalf of my colleagues, we look forward to working with our district partners and the commission to meet the needs of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Anyone else in the room? Okay, thank you, everyone. There'll be another opportunity at the end of the meeting. So we'll move on to subcommittee reports. There was not a steering group meeting between our last meeting and today. Finance subcommittee, does anyone want to give just a quick update? I realize the substance of our discussion is related to your work, but maybe someone could do a quick summary of the.
Great, sorry. Emily is on, I saw her come in, so I didn't know if she had.
How she thinks. Emily, I know I didn't ask you in advance, but if you wanted to do a snapshot update, you're welcome to.
Hi, I'd be happy to. Hello, commission members. I'm Emily Kornheiser. And at our last meeting, we heard a sort of first summary from Dr. Larry Pikus about a report he had done on essentially what is possible in education spending, as well as hearing from consultants to the Agency of Education on what they are doing related to spending on education. And then we began a process to look at how we want to organize essentially our recommendations. We have a list of every idea for reform related to education spending on education, whether that is a tax strategy or a cost driver strategy. And committee members are going to begin analyzing all the considerations that need to be taken into account when looking at any of those policies. And in our next meeting, we're going to have those compiled for discussion. I think we did not have enough time with any of our 3 guests in our meeting. And so folks are welcome, we're welcome to follow up. And I know that both myself and I think some of the association members had some concerns with some of the data in the data analysis that we looked at, and continuing concerns with the resources that we have available to us related to data. And I think that's going to be a topic later in your meeting, but just sort of, I think that summarizes where we are and where we're going to be. Our next meeting was scheduled for Veterans Day, which is not a work day for many of the folks involved with our meetings. And so we are pushing it out 1 week to, I believe that's the 18th, at the same time we usually meet. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. Commission members, any questions from members or things to add from members?
I just want to address some of the questions around the data. So we referenced the memo that the VSA, the SBA, and GASBO submitted. I was really disappointed by the authors. Those are the exact same people that the Agency of Education proactively reached out to involve in improving our data infrastructure and making reporting more meaningful in the field. I think the agency has been a very collaborative and productive partner in this work, and I think the memo is antithetical to that, and frankly unproductive to what we're all here to do. I will provide a written response, but I do think it's important for the commission to have a deep understanding of where we were, where we are, and where we're headed as it relates to data. I'll just share a couple highlights of things I think are important to frame up for the conversation. The memo says that the agency needs to deliver on the data framework. The data framework referenced is a very simplified version of the framework that the agency has created and is working with our consultants to deliver and prioritize reporting. So it's a little bit ironic that that was an accusation. We have delivered analysis around reporting and spending and enrollment and performance and expenditure, and that has been analyzed and looking at different patterns around SUSD size and need across the state. I think it's also important to talk about the need for us as a state to really engage in data validation and improving our data systems. I think it's very apparent that we have not had a robust data infrastructure in education for over a decade. And that's been a lot of source of frustration, certainly for legislatures. They're trying to make data-driven decisions, and also I think for school boards. So this is an issue that we all share, and it's related not just to how the Agency of Education organizes our data, but how things are coded in the field. And it's been, one of my priorities since assuming the role of interim secretary to improve the data quality, data accessibility, and transparency. And we have done that in a very collaborative way, and also owning where there are discrepancies. And that's part of the reason we've been going through a very thorough data validation process involving many of the people listed in that memo and others to really go school by school, SD by SD, and really understand those inconsistencies. And that's been something I prioritize with my staff, that we engage very deeply in that work. There certainly were some misalignment issues as we think about expenditure relative to the chosen student counts, and that has been corrected as we've done all of our subsequent reporting. The fact of the matter is the statewide trends hold and the story is consistent, but it's very important that we drill down to this level to verify every detail, because we need to do a different level of analysis, and that's really important to the commission's work. There's been a lot of conversation around ADM, and that's important, but the commission is asking for us to do analysis that goes beyond ADM and looking at programmatic enrollment patterns, such as looking at early college, and dual enrollment, and tuitioning patterns. And all of those are a subset of the broader ADM, and it's important for us to bring clarity and understanding around how we are looking at student counts and what they inform in terms of programmatic decisions and also spending. I also want to call out that in a very proactive way, the agency identified the need to bring on more resources. We contracted with APA Consulting back in July to help us with expanding our capacity for analytics, because what is required of the commission is above and beyond how we're currently staffed to deliver, and above and beyond our current systems capabilities. And so they have been working with us very closely in developing the Listen and Learn Tour. The Listen and Learn Tour is designed specifically to involve data validation. That's why phase 2 of our process was working with regional education leaders across the state and drilling down, not just at the state profile report, but data at a regional and SU and SD level, so that we can identify where we might have had some coding inconsistencies over the past decade that need to be corrected. And we are committed to re-releasing that state profile report, which will be next week, context around that and understanding of what goes in to the different data reports. And then when the commission decided not to hire an education finance consultant, the agency did. And we've contracted with New Solutions K-12 to be a resource. They're a trusted partner that's worked with Vermont and many of our business managers and superintendents across the state, and they're helping us to identify ways in which we can come up with some short-term cost containment strategies. So I just think it's unfortunate that this is the narrative. The reality is we all share and own in this problem, and we need to be able to be open and transparent and engaging people where we might have issues with data, or we might have issues with prior analysis, so that we all come together collectively to address that, so that we have a common set of data that we can work on, that we can use to inform decision making. So in terms of next steps as it relates to the agency, we've done a tremendous amount of work. And I'm really proud of our team and the engagement they've had with the field. We're now at the point where we can do different level of analysis, and that's exciting, and that's a great point to be. And we're going to continue to push as fast as we can. But as I've said in the past, we had to go a little slow to go fast, because we had to make sure that we responded to some of the feedback we were hearing from the field and really dig deep, school by school, district by district, to make sure that we were factoring in those nuances and correcting some of the coding issues that have been persistent in our data systems for a long time. So we will continue to be a partner. We will continue to move forward and be responsive to the needs. We will move as quickly as we can, and we'll continue to come back to the commission and ask for prioritization. We, as I mentioned, in terms of the immediate next steps, we are going to re-release the state profile report. I do appreciate everyone that's been part of that very thorough data validation process. It was really critical that we have business managers across the state involved in that effort, and we're very grateful for them sharing their expertise. We will also submit a report around our education finance system to really communicate in very plain language our current system and the challenges and opportunities, along with some considerations around short-term cost containment that have been based on the analysis that we've all reviewed together. Again, I just wanted to make sure that we were clear that this is all of us working together to do this, and it does take some time and it takes resources to get this done right, along with an openness to acknowledge that many of these issues that we're working on have been longstanding, and the agency is really being proactive in addressing them.
Thanks, Zoe. We have a pretty substantive discussion later about the data, so I probably won't jump into that right now. Are there any other updates from the finance subcommittee or questions for the subcommittee? I'm just going to do a really quick update. The communication and engagement subcommittee has not met. We have our regular meeting on the 18th, but I did want to let the commission know the request for proposals for an engagement consultant closed a little over a week ago. There are 8 proposals to review. So at their meeting, our meeting on the 18th, we will review those proposals and discuss and hopefully a recommendation for the full commission in December. So that will be exciting to move that forward. We are still intending to hold our engagement sessions even this month and in December, since we still won't have a consultant by then, but so that's an update. Okay, so the substance of our conversation today, and we have a long time to do it, so we'll try to check in midway through this discussion time to see if folks need a break. So we will discuss our preliminary report and short-term recommendations. First, I just wanted to logistically talk through and certainly get the commission's suggestions for a different way, although I don't know a way, about the drafting of the report. So we do not have support in report writing allocated to the group. In the past, for commissions where that's the case, the chair has drafted the report. And so my assumption, which is why I drafted a summary outline for you all for today, is that I would be playing the role of drafting the report. I don't take that lightly, and having done it before, whatever I draft goes back to the commission for deep feedback and editing. But I just wanted to let the group know that part of the discussion is to inform the writing of that report. My goal would be to circulate some sort of draft to you pretty quickly after today's meeting, so that we can get started on everything from the editing portion of it to, oh, you're representing something that is not what the commission wants. And so I just wanted to say that out loud. I'm not sure we've really talked about that as a commission yet. This is an unusual commission in that it also has a steering group whose job is to steer. And so I am open to different ways of doing that. I'm open to using the steering group as a first, but anyway, I'll stop talking. Are there thoughts, comments, or a different opinion about how that process should work?
I would just say you should definitely use the steering committee as a resource that we meet again, I think on the 14th.
Oh, yes, that's right. We did. I have to remind myself. Yes. Okay, that's helpful.
And,
actually, that's helpful because then I can bring what's prepped by then as well.
I'm more concerned about it all falling on your shoulders without getting at least some camaraderie.
I appreciate that. The 14th at 8:30, which is a Thursday, is when the next steering group meeting is. And just in the interest of transparency, whatever draft I turn out will be turned out to the full commission for feedback. We will have a discussion opportunity with the steering group on the 14th and then the full commission at its December meeting. Okay, so we've got two And sort of the third item is related to data, which is all baked into the report itself. What you have and what I had given to you all after our last meeting is what I hope is just an outline that reflects the concepts raised in two sections. The first is preliminary findings, which in my mind, that's a little bit of like context setting. Findings is the word in the law. It says we will bring preliminary findings. The extent to which we can bring findings or just status, I think, is up to this group. But I'm using the term preliminary findings because that's what the law says. So that's the first section. I'll kind of run through how I think we could structure our discussion today if people have a different idea. I'd like to spend some time on that list to make sure. Right now it's just a regurgitation of what you all said. I'd like to run through it and make sure that those pieces are indeed what the commission wants to include in the report. And then when we move our discussion to strategies, we did brainstorm. And we brainstormed under the question of short-term cost containment strategies because that is what, again, the language of the law. I think everyone recognizes that some of the things brainstormed are not necessarily short-term. So to be efficient with our conversation, I thought that we would have just a very high-level run through of those brainstorms just to say, is this implementable in 2025 or not? The finance subcommittee is doing a much deeper analysis of that, and that will inform our work for sure. This is a little bit more of a rougher cut to be able to say, how do we target our discussion time on that list? Because again, that is not a list that is yet the perspective of the commission. It is simply we went around the table. And when we are at the point of vetting any recommendations, if we have recommendations, then we would be doing that through our guiding principles. And then we have a discussion around data in general. Zoe referenced it. We had a conversation in August 5th with the data framework, which was a list of things that we thought the commission needed. Zoe referenced that. It would be helpful, I think, to have a status update of that conversation. So that is how I'm chunking our conversation. First with preliminary findings, second with the cost containment strategies, and third with data. I sort of recognize the data piece is probably infused throughout the preliminary findings part. Pausing for comments if there aren't any, I'll keep going.
The data really should inform the findings though. So I feel like that needs to be first.
I think some findings, I mean, if you look at our first finding draft, is an acknowledgement. This preliminary report should serve as a call to action for budget development. So I think if we start with the findings and then just infuse the data conversation
as long as
because I think some of our things identified to go in the report, it's like context building, I think. Does that make sense to folks? You're right, I don't want that discussion to be disjointed, but okay.
Megan?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, hi, I'm wondering if maybe what you currently have is Roman numeral 3 preliminary findings, if it would maybe, to Oliver's point, help clarify, like maybe we could rename that background or something that kind of indicates that this is that we're creating the framework for what's going to follow and save the heading of preliminary findings for what we are finding based on the data that will arrive.
Yeah, I'm just taking notes on my own time.
I think we're talking about two different things. I mean, I think we're sort of talking about creating the framework for this report, but then then we're talking about the findings that are coming out of the work that the commission has done to date.
Yeah, I think some of them lend themselves as more as background and context, and some may or may not be preliminary findings. So, yeah, I think the final product will need to delineate between those two. And these are not in any order. I didn't attempt to move in order. So why don't we start? Oh, sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I guess this is more of an observation, and I think it's a quandary that we're all wrestling with. That I know we have sort of an initial recommendation, and I'm assuming we're all in agreement that is to impact FY26, right, the next fiscal year. The reality is, if there are things that the legislature is going to act upon, highly unlikely much of that is going to impact FY26, right? Everybody's building budgets at this point. But where are we in terms of FY27? And I understand, our long range, recommendations aren't going to be coming forward until next December. But the reality is we could be making recommendations for this legislative session that aren't going to take place until the next fiscal year. And I know that's not the way the law is written for us, but I wonder to what ability do we have some discretion in sort of chunking things in terms of initial recommendations, intermediate recommendations, and then understanding that there will be more long-term recommendations.
I think your point is, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, I think your point is well taken. And in fact, if the commission decides that its message in December, my goal is to not deliver something. I think it's really important for us to deliver something. And that's not just because I'm the chair, but because we're here for a reason. And in all seriousness, that there are enough forces looking at this commission and questioning whether or not it can do anything. So wanting to produce something is really important, and wanting to produce something that is useful for the General Assembly is really important. And yet everything you said is also true. And so what we produce may be something that is phrased slightly differently than it's asking us for. And I think the will of the commission, if that's where we land, we should be open to landing that. In other words, open to saying, letting this report say, this isn't exactly what you asked for, but this is what we've determined that at this time. I think that's fair. And then I also just know that whatever it is has to have, I do worry about moving forward, this commission having even less of an impact if what we produce isn't of substance. That does not necessarily mean actionable by FY26. Sorry, I jumped over your train.
No, all good. I just would echo an openness to that. I think that's a good point, because I also think we've acknowledged that there are some elements that will be longer term discussions, but to do that successfully, the discussions have to start this legislative session, right? And so again, if we want the commission to have a voice on those things, we're gonna have to spend some time now to think about how to sort of kick that off, as opposed to just waiting until January when the legislative session starts.
Zoe and then Oliver.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think one of the findings is that there are limited opportunities for short-term cost containment, and we need to be able to identify what those are, but really begin looking farther out in the medium and long-range strategies that are really going to put us on a path for sustainability. And I think we can bring that as a finding.
I was going to third this comment as well, but another suggestion might be sort of in the intro to the report, is to sort of maybe put together a high-level timeline that sort of illustrates where we're at now, where school boards typically are at in their budgeting cycle, overlay with the legislative cycle, and then the date of the final report. Because I think to your point, by the time we get to the final report, that's not going to influence anything for what, 3 fiscal years, realistically? So I think having some sort of a timeline to help people visually understand that would be helpful.
Yeah, just to be clear, the legislation does not limit it to recommendations that only impact FY26, but it just asks for preliminary recommendations that can be implemented in the legislative session of 25. And I would also strongly support whatever recommendations we come up with, for fear of legislators feeling the push even more and actually getting ahead of the commission. So I think the more guidance the commission can provide the legislature, the better.
The one group that isn't represented at this table are the people that are paying the bills.
You just have to clarify.
Yes.
We all pay and so that's just kind of every time.
And I think the legislators are here
I
specifically for that.
But they are very loud out there right now. And if we don't have something laid, yeah, the legislature will take action. The pressure is going to be strong enough so that nobody's going to want to go home without doing something. If it's important that this commission be able to say, because I think we all realize there's nothing we can really do short term. But we're gonna have to show that we do have a plan going forward, that there are serious, proposals in the works. We're still filling them out, we're still getting data, we're still, working on them, but that there are there's light at the end of that tunnel. Because if we can't, then the tendency will be to say, forget it, we're going to do something that we want to do. So it's going to be important that we come up with a list of proposals moving forward that, and there can be a variety of things that can be looked at, but it's important that we have something serious and concrete to share.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the ways that we would be able to do that is by, and maybe this goes without saying, and it sounds repetitive, but making sure that each one of us as members of this commission, if there is something that either we as individuals or our respective organizations have as an idea, this is the group to vet it through. And I think that there is enough there's lots of different public sentiment, but one element of that sentiment is that there is some solution that someone, and there's many someones in that definition, and in all seriousness, that nobody's saying out loud. And I don't know that to be true, but I think as members of the commission, in order for this to have a chance at moving this really difficult thing forward, it would be to put it out there. So I think that that's part of how we have something concrete, even if the something is not like, we made an effort and here's what we think, and it, and it's true. We are not the General Assembly, and our job is not a decision-making body, but it can inform the decision-making body. Jay and then Jeff.
To paraphrase Representative Kornheiser in a way, one of the things that we should be able to do here, though, is throw out ideas without people saying, oh, if you're supporting X, you're supporting Y, and we're just throwing out concepts. And I got several people in my own membership come to me and say, asking about this or that. And I said, EPA, we haven't endorsed anything yet. But we are open to throwing out concepts that we think should be discussed, and we're going to listen to what other people think should be discussed. And I think I want to remind all of us, no harm has to be one of the first things that we have to consider. Let's not make any rash decisions for political expediency in the short term that's going to hurt us in the long term. So be really thoughtful about that. And let's throw ideas out like that. Let's not have anything that's a sacred cow that we say we can't touch it out. Doesn't mean we're going to support it, but let's talk about anything that's out there and hopefully have open conversations. And maybe we'll come to a situation where we have some recommendations for the General Assembly that are palatable.
So, in looking at the law in section F2 that we're discussing, right, and that's what we're focused on right now, it does say recommendations, including short-term cost containment considerations, but it doesn't say other things. So I think we should be looking elsewhere and not just cost containment. I agree with John that it may be difficult for us to make recommendations on cost containment that affect next fiscal year. Schools are doing that hard work right now, but there are education funding system issues that could be enacted fairly early in January and February that would affect positively town meeting day votes. That I think we should think about and consider. The cap at $400,000 for a home site or a home has been updated for a bunch of years, and we know that the price of homes have gone up, and so that's catching more and more people who are not earning necessarily any more, but their home site is valued significantly more because of the housing market. As well, those just above $90,000 are being caught up in some of those same issues. And so I think we could recommend updates to the funding system that would positively affect people on town meeting day. And it's not a cost containment, it's just an education funding update.
Yeah, one of the things that Craig, you had said last time is what do we mean by, is it cost containment or is it property tax relief or is it all of the above? And so I think that's kind of related to that.
We might also think about just sort of teasing out some of the ideas that we have put on the table, but do float around from time to time. And one that always comes to my mind is if we only had fewer superintendents and fewer supervisory unions, we'd save gazillions of dollars. And there's a statewide candidate now who's, saying that. So I think we need to take those things on and put them in here and just sort of, in part, help sort of dispel some of the myths out there.
Well, and I think that's where data really are important. And if I can just sort of respond a little bit, Joey, I think the memo that I was an author of was not intended to disparage the work that the agency is doing on Listen and Learn. It's incredible, and it's very time intensive, and it's very much overdue, frankly. Because every community in Vermont needs to have these conversations, and they need to trust that what they're seeing is an accurate picture of where they, and so I'm very grateful to you and your team and the consultants for doing that. It's legwork, it's time intensive. I think the point that maybe didn't come out as clearly as I had hoped is that work is different from the work that this commission has to do in order to, number one, produce findings on December 15th that are connected to the property taxpayers that Ann is hearing from and Peter's hearing from, we're all hearing from. And so that's where I feel like it's been missing, is some of the pieces of data that have been requested, that were part of the data framework, but that we haven't seen explicitly provided to us, I think would help us provide initial findings and start to dispel, or at least prioritize, like, okay, I hear all the time, just get rid of early college and dual enrollment, right? And that's a drop in the bucket in the ed fund, right? Like, everyone has their solution or their idea. 4% of students pay tuition, right? Like, that's a drop in the bucket. We don't have a common sense, a common understanding of how the education fund is used right now, what the sources of funding are, and I think that would really, I would feel producing a report that didn't at least have that data, because that's all in the ed fund outlooks, right? Like, I think it's pretty, now exactly how that money is being spent at the local level, that gets more complex, and we wouldn't want to draw broad conclusions necessarily, but I think the buckets can be large enough that we can say, in general, we're spending at the local level. It's like 95% of the ed fund, 93% of the ed fund, and 80% of that is salary and benefit. Like, some big buckets of here's the expenditures, because all of us are talking about cost drivers or ideas that we have, but they're not grounded in any shared understanding. So I think I just want to clarify, the work that you're doing with Listen and Learn is critical work, is good work, and appreciative of the interactions and the partnerships that you're having with local officials. This work is different, I think.
And I appreciate that, and I think it is important for us to get to another level of analysis for this committee, and that's what we're working towards, right? So part of the Listen and Learn is helping us to do that, because we're getting deeper into the data, and we're now able to do some of that disaggregation. So we're kind of at that point now where we feel confident we can start to do that more specificity, give that more specificity, because it's needed. Right now, we've been looking at broad expenditure, and there's a lot of different sources. We've tried to do stack charts where we can to show the different sources, be that state, local, federal, and other differentiating sources. We're at a point now where we can do deeper dive, and we're excited about that. But it is a process to get there.
I wonder, and this is kind of to several people's point, so my thought about how to frame this conversation was prior to memos. The reason I pulled back out our own data framework is simply for us to do a status check of it. So the steering group in August just frame, this was a list, you can see it in the way that it was framed. Here's the things we want, and then a blank section on sources. And all we did as a steering group was have a general discussion. And so the reason I put it on today's discussion is to go through those things and say, what's the status? And I think that might be helpful because a lot of it has been produced and a lot of it is not. And that would allow us to say, here's what we have and here's what we don't have, or here's what we have in part. And so maybe we do that right now because that helps to frame the rest of the conversation.
Just on the data, I think one of the challenges is, I think Zoe alluded to it, is a lot of the data collection is sort of pulled in from disparate sources, and there's lack of consistency in the collection methodologies. So when you aggregate it up, you get problems. But I think a lot of the data, while it may not be perfect, may be good enough. So part of what I think might be helpful is if there could be a grading of the data, the underlying data. So it's like A, it's perfect, we can take it to the bank. B, it's pretty good, but directionally accurate, but not perfect, right? C, questionable, something like that might be helpful. So that way we can move quickly.
I think part of what we're trying to do with the state profile report in its first iteration was calling out caveats. So you saw on almost every data chart, it was like, well, this may be coded differently, right? But I think your point around just kind of broad labels around what's the level of confidence with this, because I do think there is a need to more quickly produce data, but there also needs to be a recognition that there may not be perfection, just for what you're describing, or that we're mapping on a lot of different data collections that have not previously been aligned or analyzed together. And we are building in processes in the field of saying, okay, we're actually sending something out today, 48 hours, please confirm this. Because I'll say that even on this one point around tuitioning, there's differences in how that's coded within supervisory unions when public SDs will tuition to another. There's some duplication there. So it's not just related to the independent schools. There's a lot of complexity around how the governance models work and where students move within a supervisory union and then from one district to another, from district to out of state, so forth. So we can do that, and we are trying to do kind of quick iterations of validation as we go forward so that we don't have a lag in between reporting. But everyone needs to acknowledge that there may be some outliers. And I think to this point, we've identified what those outliers are, and those probably will be consistent throughout that we can go ahead and flag as we're going through. But I think that's a great suggestion, and it'll help us to kind of expedite.
Yeah, so why don't we use the framework because that was our own starting point. We also probably, since August 5th, have things that we would have added to this list, which we can do as we go. But I think this, it's worthwhile to just start at the top. And even how they're phrased might be different. This was a brainstorm list at the time. And so what I'm looking at for folks on the folks on the commission is the data framework from August 5th. It was linked to your agenda materials. And again, without any of us being led to the way that this is structured. At the time, it seemed useful to structure it based on these segments, but I would have us not pay that much attention to that. It's just a list. And the questions we're asking ourselves right now are what's the current status? Have we had this? And what's the kind of quality of it, for lack of a better word? And that's not quality from a judgmental standpoint. That's just what's the current status of it? Because I think that kind of analysis is part of a preliminary finding. This is what we have and this is what we don't have. So the first is statewide demographic projections, historic and predicted.
Hey, where are you reading from? I don't see it.
So page 2, there's a
Is the data framework that you're looking at, or
the data framework, yeah.
So not the draft outline.
not the draft? So I just want to call out the data framework is, there's an error with a link on the website, so anybody's following on is going to see it.
I got mine, I'll put it in the chat. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. But it was an invite that was sent to us. for today's meeting.
Okay, so,
And I think some of the,
do you want me to run down kind of what we have recorded and then what we're working on? Would that be helpful?
yeah,
to
that
start?
sounds good.
Okay.
I'll, in my notes, like, add things and then I'll go back.
There is no
Okay. We have not focused yet on the statewide demographic projections. I think that would be helpful to bring in as context. The supervisory districts and unions, much of this has been reported, maybe not calling out towns, so that could be something to add.
And Zoe, sorry, I just want, it's the statewide profile, school profile, what is the report?
So that is in the state profile report. We'll also have that in the finance overview, because we'll do a breakdown of the governance structure. So just remind people how it maps on from supervisory unit to school district, to school board's numbers served, operating and non-operating grade levels. So there'll be more detail around that.
Thanks. I just wanted to be able to put it in my notes.
Yes. So the cost per pupil, so this is what we talked about, we are updating based on ADM, and that will be released next week. In terms of tuition, this is coming. That's actually one of the data collections we're doing right now to validate some of the codes, because where we're seeing some of the education is actually within supervisory union from public school. Staffing, we've been able to do 100 staff for 100 students. In order for us to get down to the class level, we actually need some additional information from the field so we can see the breakdown of classes by grade and how that's structured around the core craft classes. But we at least do have kind of a broad view of that, but not by classes. Minimum maximum salary by district. So is this, just to make sure I'm clear, is this breaking out the different type of staff in each building? What is needed here?
I don't know, I didn't invite numbers, it's like another one of those lists that like was collectively.
I think they evolved, right?
Probably.
Yeah, I think it was just understanding the compensation bands within the different bargaining agreements. So there's typically two, one covering teachers, one covering support staff, and they have sort of a salary schedule that has a, so you can see starting salaries and you can sort of see generally where they cap out. So I think that was, and I think some of the state profile data looked a little bit at.
We looked at, we analyzed staff salaries and we looked at trends by the size of the supervisory union and need. And so what we found is that the larger supervisory unions and districts tended to pay teachers more, but the needs were also less.
Right.
So we saw that as a high level trend. We don't have all of the bargaining unit agreements on file, so we haven't been able to drill down to that level. So that would be something we would need to capture and analyze. Yeah.
What's the definition of need? What's the definition of need? You said some have, water.
Oh, sorry, I thought you meant need for my data needs.
No, no.
I had lots of needs. So need was defined by students that qualify for free and reduced lunch, and we also looked at students that are part of our special education, deliver special education services, and English language learners were part of how we looked at that in terms of overall trends, and we broke it out by those different categories. We have been hearing a lot around the need for having a consistent measure of poverty, given that now universal school meals, there may not be as many parents completing those forms. That's a national issue that many states are having. But I will say that as we looked at the trends so far, the FRL has been pretty consistent. We haven't seen huge shifts based on the time period that we're analyzing, but I would just preview that moving forward, we will need to think about that. And I know there's already some thought to that as with the release of additional data being collected around that.
So you keep going, because I also thought you were asking this question the same way that Zoe was. What we should do when we get to the bottom is, part of I think even the tension between what you shared and kind of what's been put out is we are right now using the data from the agency, which I agree is data that we haven't been able to look at in a long time, and it's really good work. And we might also need different data. And so
That's right.
this is really helpful. Let's go through and then go back up to the top to say, and now what else do we need? Or it either exists and we're going to be able to pull it out in short order, or it doesn't. But the fact that we can say, here's what we have and here's what we don't have will still be useful.
And we may have come up with something that we want that will be informative to us in the 18-month plan.
Right.
For the future. And that's
Right.
what
Or
people
we
raise want.
have it in this format, and what we really need it is analyzed this way. It's okay that we don't.
Right.
We just want to be clear on that.
And I would say it would help us too, from the agency perspective, as we're prioritizing and requesting more of the field, right? So all of this creates a burden at a school and district level to be able to stop, take time to provide us with more data. So it would be helpful as we go through this to just prioritize that. So in terms of what's next here, so just to clarify, if we are to look at class size, we would need some additional information from the field so that we could do the appropriate groupings and know the number of classes within each grade. I think the min-max salary, we know the trends, but if we were to get to the level of detail district by district, we would need to review the collective bargaining agreements, and I don't think we have that, and that analysis hasn't been done. Provisional licensure status, we do have that information. It has not been published yet. We can share that. Staff retention, the metric for staff retention has been a 3-year metric, and the feedback we've received is it'd be much more helpful to see that year over year. So there is some work that we need to do to get to that metric, but it's doable, but a little bit more time. Let's see, in terms of the breakdown of the education payment by object and function code, at this point, we've provided just the high level and looking at the education outlook for fiscal year for the past 2 years, the actuals for the past 2 years and the actuals for this next year. But now we're able to do that breakdown because we've identified the correct funding object and function code series in partnership with the business managers. So that's forthcoming. The education fund sources. Yes.
Yeah, next to the sources and uses, I guess I'd ask if anybody thinks what we're asking for there is beyond what's already on the ed fund outlooks. It looks like those next 2 bullets, ed fund sources, ed fund uses, and what I see in the parenthetical.
No, it's totally what's in the ed fund outlooks. The issue is, you want to see it over time. And so, that's not at our fingertips, right? We've seen some presentation from the tax department at the finance committee, looking at ed fund sources, but nothing on uses. And I personally think that that's a really important data set for us to be looking at as a commission.
So those, just to clarify, those are published year over year. So what we're asking for is, can we just compile that in a year over year framework? Is that the ask?
Is the uses that we're talking about, because there's been a number of shifts of things in and out of the ed fund. The high school in Vermont is one of them. Adult basic ed, the major pension cost, hundreds of millions of makeup is all being done out of the general fund, but the cost, the employer's contribution to the pension fund, present contribution, has been put into the ed fund. And then there's universal school meals that got put in, but I'm just,
I think
and then there's the source, we went to the sales.
Right, so I think there's a lot of questions in general about, and you raised this last time too, Craig, is that about shifting costs versus contain, right? But there, one of the ideas on our own list and also that you hear in the ether is, well, if we just kept the education fund focused on what is sort of core to education, then that would fix it. We need some data to even know if that's an accurate statement. And even if it is an accurate statement, it doesn't negate the fact that if you don't pay for it here, you have to pay for it somewhere. But it's a question that
We're not do it.
Or not do it.
Exactly. And yeah, so I looked at 10 years worth of ed fund outlooks and built charts and graphs, and somebody said to me, well, you probably shouldn't show that. That should probably come from the tax department, which is why we've been asking for it in meetings, and not having it is difficult, because I could share it, I could share what I have, but it's not really, it shouldn't come from me.
So we shared at the last education finance subcommittee the prior 2 years. So what you're asking for is a longer trend line?
There's a longer trend. I looked at 10 years.
10 years.
And I think, and I also looked at what I call local uses and local sources. And we're cute in Vermont because we have a statewide property tax, but really, when you look at other states, property taxes are considered a local source. Property taxes are also what's used to fund municipal services, right? So I combined both homestead and non-homestead property taxes, net of the property tax credit, and called that local sources. And then state sources are all the other sales and use tax, meals and rooms, et cetera. And then in terms of uses, it's the education payment, special education, triple E, transportation, and tech ed. That those would be the local uses of the ed fund, because that's the local business of running a school. We're paying for schools to be run. And when you look at what's happened in the ed fund over this 10-year period, local uses have gone up on average 5% a year. And the prevailing narrative is when you're losing students, you shouldn't see that kind of cost curve. So that's an area to dig into, right? Like, how do you bend the curve so that we have more of a relationship with our demographic loss? But we've seen a huge spike in state uses. As revenue was healthy, particularly during the pandemic, retirement costs got shipped, new universal meals program added, PCBs for a little bit. Now it's not clear what's happening with PCBs. Like, the state funding isn't there, but we're still testing, so I don't know what happens when those state funds go away. So you can start to, I'm happy to share what I did with folks on the commission, but to me, it's looking at it over a 10-year period that shows pre-COVID and post-COVID trends, where you can start to see how shifts from a general fund transfer to 100% of the sales and use, they have impacted what happened with property tax rates. I just think it helps us dig into the story a little bit.
It helps us peel back the layers to the points earlier that we have some people saying, well, that's not that much, that's just a little bit. Much like when you start adding all of these amounts up, it adds to something. And then I think part of our long-term goal of this commission is to take a look at what they are and what is essential to provide our students with a quality education. And are there things that we need to change? Are there things that we need to pull back? They're the tough questions I think we need to look at as a commission for the future, the next couple of years.
What's the purpose of the ed fund? Is it, it's like, it's free money. I mean, we don't have to find the money. It just somehow finds itself, right? And that is it. It's a self-balancing fund. So more programs get put into it. The more the property, and there's no corresponding increase in state revenue, the more property taxes pick up.
And then you
Is that $20 million more during COVID because of all the sales tax then?
But then programs got pushed into it. It's like, oh, that's more money. So now we can add universal meals. But
well, and the reality is that with lots of things, we should be careful when we say there's nothing that could be done this session, because maybe there could, but we need to do it based on actual data. And there's also this narrative of, yeah, but that's kind of what you were saying, Mike. Yeah, but that's only this amount of money, or don't bother doing this because it's only this amount of money. But if we need to surface all of those things, because collectively that might be the short-term thing that buys us credibility as a commission, frankly, to have the bigger, tougher conversations moving forward. So clarifying question to you, Craig, and then I don't know, I think it actually might be helpful to look at it. Is it like feasible to be able to pull a 10-year look back? Like, I literally don't know what I'm asking, but.
I mean, I'm guessing the Joint Fiscal Office has published years and years of I mean, it's.
So it'd be like a
started.
mail merge.
Yeah, so there's 16 different programs that are appropriations, that are part of the ed fund outlook. And so what we shared is the 23 actual, 24 actual, and the 25 projected. And what I'm hearing is to try to build that forward.
Yeah, and I think, the call that I made was to try to allocate what's a local use versus a state use, what's a local source versus a state source. Because we have focused quite a bit on cost containment strategies that are related to decisions made at the local level. But there are decisions that get made at the state level that have an impact on the ed fund and property taxes. So we haven't really unpacked with that.
Yeah. So just so outside of these statewide programs, what are some of the other things you're considering statewide decisions?
I'm just looking at the lines in the ed fund outlook.
Okay, yeah.
And so for a state use, because it's a state policy decision, flexible pathways, universal school meals, English learner services, which has gone down over the 10 years, PCV, retirement payments, community schools, and then there's another line.
Yeah. We have technical education, I'm not sure if we said that, small school support, transportation aid, state-based students.
Right, so I would consider the ed payment, special education, transportation aid, and tech aid. I wasn't sure what small schools grant was in terms of the local decision or was that a state policy decision that was made to support the existence of small schools. But I chose those top four as like, this is what's happening in terms of the operation of schools. Not just the local budget, but the provision of special education, like that state payment, that block grant is a factor in our local budget that we budget against. Same thing with the transportation payment and tech aid.
I think that the question is, can we look at older publications by the Joint Fiscal Office and put it into a longer year-over-year spreadsheet?
And the reason I think this is a worthwhile one, that whole section is a worthwhile one because it is a question we get asked a lot, and it would be helpful to have a factual answer to it and not a theoretical one. And B, as I said, it could be, and it would come from a decision, a potential, and again, we don't make decisions, we make recommendations, but it may be a recommendation to not do something, to avoid the shift factor. Or this commission does have recommendations about shifting to a different source because that's appropriate. I mean, either outcome would be fine, however.
I'd just be a little bit cautious about using the line items in the ed fund outlook. Having spent many years as well looking through that, I don't find it to be particularly useful for the purposes that I think we're charged with. Because if you go through some of those line items, they're like some of those are minuscule. You're really tracking sort of some legislative history more than focusing on really, I think what we're focused on, which is identifying what's actually driving the cost of education, right? And I think some of the functions and objects and focusing more on that, I think would be more useful over, and I agree, I think a 10-year period of time would be really nice. And the way I envision it is, the total sort of ed spending and then break it into those different categories and then look at the relative growth of each of those categories over that time period and get a sense of, what's really, driving the growth in terms of the volume and the rate of growth, right? And I just don't think we're going to get that from the ed fund.
But we have to do both. We have to do both because property tax rates are a function of all the activity that's happening in the ed fund. It's not a function of just what's happening at the local level.
So I think what we've done to date is we were able to look at object code, but as a percent of total expenditures. And so it's breaking that out by what's funded by the ed fund.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because we do have that at
Exactly. I think that.
And it's an interesting pattern as we think from the agency perspective around how we support the field, right? So if certain schools may not be taking advantage of federal money, then that's an opportunity for us to lean in and say, hey, this could be something to take advantage of. So I think it's important for us as the agency to have the full view, but I'm hearing we need to be able to pull out by the education fund. And so that's some work that we can do as a next iteration. And I could share just with the group, I mean, I think that overall trends are interesting to look at, and they do tell a pattern of when there are some additional federal dollars, where the needs, how that met the needs, right? Because those needs may also persist as we continue to move forward and thinking about the overall system. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, this is actually in our list of potential, it's in the preliminary findings part, which was maybe we're renaming to be context, but I actually think it's helpful for the public to understand. This is actually not just a commission about spending. Spending is one part of what we have to do to kind of crack this. That's about how we spend, but remember that how we spend in Vermont is intricately connected to our governance structure and our delivery model, which is why the commission is asking us to do that. And even within finance, it's spending, but it is revenue generation. How do we do it? Should we continue to do it by property taxes? And it is the use of education funding. So every single one of these things is an important part of this conversation. We will not solve this problem without touching every single one of those. And I think actually just that message alone is really important, because I think we have a public who thinks whichever one of those is either least hurtful to that individual or least impactful on something else that people value. They think that's the panacea. None of these are panaceas. And that by itself may be a really important point for this preliminary report to say. So I think that that's relevant. That's why this kind of dive is important. And that's why the, what did we call it? A call to action on our own spending, even without, like, even as a blunt sword coming into budget season, is still an important part. So, sorry, I took us off of the database.
The other data that I don't have, I did a forum 2 weeks ago, and all of my opponents had the number that the Roxbury School had 34 students and 31 staff. I can't verify or not verify that, but they got it from somewhere. Maybe they counted cars in the parking lot. But if that is even close to true, that's concerning. I don't have those numbers. I don't, and the school size, I've heard several groups say, just disregard Picus, it's not Vermont. It is the rest of the country. And we are, according to him, spending significantly more than the rest of the country. It's fine if we choose to do that, but we don't know what the trade-offs are. You know, I was at the last meeting, someone said, well, we're the most rural state in the country because we have the most towns that have less than 2,500 people. Well, we do, but in Texas, those towns are 50 miles apart, and here they're 10 miles apart. That's a different just structure. And we need to have that discussion, and we need to have, you know, are we top heavy? Could it be done more efficiently? And I haven't seen that kind of staffing numbers. I don't know if we have those. I don't know if they've ever been collected.
Well, I mean, one of the things that unfortunately Vermont is good at is disregarding outright data sometimes, right? So the reality is that is a simulation. And in some ways, that idea that it's not helpful in this moment is kind of an accurate statement, because we couldn't turn that around. But that doesn't mean that the information in there isn't instructive. But that's also true for lots of the other data we're trying to gather. And I think, Anne, you've given another example of, in Vermont right now, our delivery model is a local decision. And that local decision impacts the cost to provide that. That's why we're here. So I'm repeating myself, but I think it's worth repeating, because it's why it's not as simple as making that solution, a tweak to the ed fund, none of the things by themselves are the solution.
And from what I've heard, when we did Act 60, I wasn't on the commission. I got my news that was Senator McDonald. There were all kinds of trade-offs made. There was a local machinery and equipment tax that went to schools that was done away with, so the business community got, he keeps talking about 3 legs of the stool, but there was some tax for business that got dealt with. Current use that frequently didn't get funded got put into the ed fund, so the towns weren't left holding the bag on current use. There was no one solution. There's all kinds of balancing. And what Jeff didn't mention is, in many, if not most of our towns now, the non-homestead tax is lower than the homestead tax. We need to make that adjustment and just need kind of a few free weeks to go through it. But when you make those adjustments, there's things that happen to everybody else in there. Somebody's going to pay less. We're going to raise up the housing value, and we're going to raise up, and I've been through those battles with the House more than once. Then it's going to impact somebody else negatively. And
so again, that tweak, that is actually one of our strategies, so we can come back to that.
We don't, I think we're gonna need like the joint fiscal office to tell us when we start playing with those levels in the system, who benefits, who doesn't benefit.
Yes, we'll get to the modeling that, another version of a data conversation is what modeling would be needed to know whether or not a strategy that we've identified is benefiting anything. Oliver, go ahead, and then John.
So I just want to do a quick time check here because we only have about an hour left of this discussion, and we only have one more meeting after this to finalize the report. And we haven't actually talked about any of some of the ideas that have been floated. So I'm just wondering if we should think about scaling back the scope of this report and narrowing the focus. Because I'm not sure that we're going to have a very productive conversation on the specific options that have been put on the table without a lot of data. And it sounds like I'm not seeing a lot of data for a lot of the options that have been put on the table that are going to support any of those options. So I'm just suggesting maybe we up-level this a bit, focus on the call to action, and identify what might be some quick wins and focus on those for the next 2 meetings.
I think we have some time to at least continue through this piece. John, go ahead.
It was back to data sets, and I guess my question is reflecting on this about governance and delivery systems. It refers to things like class size by district, and I think there's some confusion sometimes. Are we talking about district? Are we talking about school? Because we have merged districts, we have supervisory unions, and that data is going to look very different between a district that has 3 schools or 4 schools versus a district that is a single school. So I think we may want to wrestle with that a little bit at some point.
And I wrote a question too. Zoe, the state profile report has some school size data, actually quite a bit in terms of, and it has district size data. So I think there's.
We have, I mean, that has already been reported in terms of the size of districts, size of schools. We do have a sense of staff, a number of staff for students. There's also a dashboard that does break down staffing by subclass for each school and provides trends from the 2019-20 school year to the 2023-24. So we have a lot of that information. What we can't break it down right now is by class size. But we can see trends in terms of changes at a school level by teacher, paraprofessional, support service, leadership, and student services. That's how we collect that data around staffing. And so that can be at school, district, and then supervisory and school district level.
Yeah, okay.
We don't have that for independent schools.
So I'm going to summarize as a whole chunk I think that we have the capacity to have some of this use of the ed fund information simply by merging existing
Right,
information.
we just showed the prior two, there was not the prior 10.
Yeah, okay. The final section of our original data framework is about student outcomes. There is some of that in the state profile report. There's much in this, so we have student assessment results disaggregated. There's probably limits to how disaggregated.
There are limits due to suppression, but when we did our regional planning, we were able to drill down a little bit more closely at the SU level. So we have some additional data there, but some of it is still suppressed.
And it doesn't, at this point, and again, this is just status updated. We have student conditions, absenteeism, discipline, MTSS.
Now we have absenteeism. So we worked on that data over the last couple of weeks, so we'll be able to report out absenteeism. In terms of MTSS status, we have a MTSS survey, which has some really interesting data that could be helpful to conversations. Is that what we're referring to here? I think that's what we talked about.
Probably, that's the metric the state has for implementation status, yeah.
And then the discipline data, I have not reviewed the discipline data. It doesn't mean that we don't have it.
Yeah. And I think that last one is a really important data set that isn't likely to be at anyone's fingertips.
Right. Right.
But that's at least something that we can acknowledge as a commission. So given what we just talked about and the list of kind of context setting pieces, this idea of a call to action is certainly something that this report could do. Acknowledge it, and it's written in here, but acknowledging the tax burden and its impact, like kind of this is why we're here. This identifying the context of funding, this is quite frankly a lot of the data that we just talked about, not all of it, but some of it. High level identification of cost drivers, the extent to which these are within or outside. I'm not sure how detailed we could get on that. I think we can make some general comments, even if it's just here's why this is complicated. We have this finance system, we have this governance structure, we have this delivery model. I mean, I think stating things like that could be instructive. Acknowledge the challenge of the timeline. I think this report could and should do that. Preview larger scale changes that will need to occur. I'm not sure that we would be, I'm not sure that we would be ready to do that, other than we could, what I've heard many times is just the fact that larger scale changes will take multiple years and multiple sessions. And so that we have, I think we can say that. How Vermont's funding system compares to other states. I think, Zoe, that's a piece that you're.
Yeah, we'll have an overview of that.
Yeah.
And it'll talk about funding along with timeline.
Yeah.
Which I think will be relevant to the broader changes.
Yeah. Commission's use of data to validate or challenge assumptions. I think we can do kind of a summary of the here's what we have and here's what we don't have that we just did. That can be useful. Ed fund uses, we just talked about that. Interconnected nature of the 3 policy areas, we just talked about that. There's convene longer term analysis of recent legislation. We might want to come back and have some conversation about that.
And who will be asking to convene?
Exactly.
I mean, I've heard people say we should do this big study in Act 46. I don't know about you guys, I'm working 60, 70 hours a week, I know what it's going on. Do Act 46 study, for example.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering who's going to do that analysis, if that's part of the information we want for the long term. And it's valid. Same, I mean, 173 and 127 equally valid. Right. Who's going to do that work?
One of the questions I have around that is how do you recreate the analysis, given that there's a lot of other influences over the time period? But there should really be a strong suggestion around having an evaluation framework with any recommendations. recommendations.
127 might be the easiest, just because it's the closest to us.
Right.
Well, but even 127 and 173
Right.
and 46, they all had pieces of
Yeah.
legislation that were put in, frankly, to get it passed.
Yeah.
And those might be the, right, so anyway, I agree. So, but the reason I did that is just, I think we actually can speak to most of what is on here at some level, maybe not the level that we wanted to do, as background and context. I think Jennifer, that is a better, that may be a better way to describe this section of the report than necessarily preliminary findings. I'm just realizing your hand is up, and I hope it hasn't been up for a really long time, because I'm just noticing it now.
Thank you. No, I was just kind of considering this, it's Roman numeral 3B, the problem statement with, fresh eyes in light of the conversation that we just had. And I do think that one of the things that we need to include, maybe a number 7, is just the relative rurality of Vermont compared to other states. And, certain parts of this state are more rural than others. And I do think that that is a real challenge because, we don't have the benefit sometimes of the economies of scale that I think a lot of us would like to see.
Yeah, thank you. That reminds me of a comment I was going to make, Anne, related to what your, we wouldn't be able to say this definitively right now, but the truth is that in Vermont, there are some delivery models that are geographically necessary and no other way to deliver it. And there are some delivery models that are more by choice and they're not geographically required. And yet you have people who say, you can't touch the delivery model because we're so rural. And that is true sometimes and true not. And I think part of what makes it challenging is how do you figure out how to understand that, allow communities to be involved in those really difficult decisions. But it's, again, it kind of goes back to there is no one sweeping piece.
Well, I think it's important too to pair with that, so the challenge of construction. In a district where, theoretically there could be some sharing, but there's no rooms in those existing buildings to close down the whole street. So that's up against our challenge with capital.
Comment about the rurality, I think there's assumptions that all schools operate the same, and they don't. There's different operational models for rural schools, and some of that is by need, right? And some of it is by design. And so looking at that, I think is helpful around, and also showing examples of where scale has been created, right, in rural communities. One thing I would like to suggest we do that I can't answer yet because I don't have the data, but we've talked a lot about when you think about education quality, and I think this is the conversation on EQS, being able to measure that. I think a very basic thing that parents and students talk about are the ability to take different courses, to participate in clubs, in sports, in electives, and foreign language, and specialized programs. Right now, we're not looking at that yet. And I do think that's a really important component as we think about educational delivery and the equity of educational delivery across the state. I think that's also a big motivator for students and parents. So I do think it would be helpful for us to be able to measure that. We have, done some analysis around course codes, but that doesn't quite get to what we're trying to represent here. And so I would just put that as a placeholder that I don't have an immediate answer to, but I think would be really valuable for the conversation. And I do want to mention too, I know facilities came up. We did publish a report around the facilities needs, and there will be a dashboard made available soon.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yep.
Zoe, I'm wondering with the EQS data, do you anticipate, well, let me ask you this. When do you anticipate having that data? I'm just curious.
For the EQS implementation?
Yeah, and just kind of looking at, through this equity lens of different, is the model that we have right now between, let's just say 2 different high schools, is that an equitable outcome?
right? I don't have a timeline today, but I know when we met with the State Board of Education around the district quality standards, we were talking about really focusing on those higher leverage education quality standards and really being able to concretely measure those. And I think it provides an interesting framework for us to do that analysis. So I mention it not having a timeline, but mentioning it because I do think it's important for us to look at.
Well, yeah, because I agree with that. I do think that's something that the commission should look at. I mean, I don't think by any stretch it sounds like this is something that we could do in time for a December 15th letter, but I'm wondering if this is something that we could sort of look at in phase 2 of the commission's work before we wrap up in another year's time. Because I think that's important.
Okay. Why don't we move, not because we're done talking about the context part of it, but I also think it may be helpful for, honestly, I think it would be helpful to reflect something back to the commission that starts to hone down this list and take today's conversation into consideration and give us something to actually talk about as it relates to that piece. To Oliver's point, I think one of the things that seems helpful is to take this list of strategies, saying as many times as we can say it, particularly for members of the public, this is just a list of things generated. These are not recommendations yet. But be able to run through them with a really blunt sword to say, this is not something we could I'm not gonna try to say that word. We could not take action on this by December. If we do that, it at least narrows down what we would start to talk about as a commission. Is that constructive?
Clarifying question. So when we're doing that, are we talking about in terms of the current budgeting cycle or the one following?
I think
the current budgeting cycle, today's November 4th.
Some of them have nothing to do with budgets. These are, could the General Assembly take action on it in this session with the original?
Coming up session.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they take action all the time to reduce property tax
Absolutely.
rates during the session.
Absolutely. Just asking
It
the
wouldn't
question.
necessarily impact the local budget process.
But it might impact my tax rate.
It sure might.
There's no surplus available.
Thank you. Go ahead, Elizabeth. I'm not great at following the screen lately. Go ahead.
Hi there. So I just wanted to say, if we go, so just to clarify, when we go through like the different ideas that are on this, the list, the preliminary draft in section 4, I think that's what we're about to do. But if we take any of those items and we determine that these aren't something that are necessarily going to be possible to recommend as a short term, would we maybe include them under part 3, section D, to kind of keep them on the list that we're still talking about these? These are still a larger scale change that we're talking about, but so that it doesn't, I just don't want to not have it show up for them in the report, if that makes any sense. Like, we still want to be able to share with them all of the items that we've been talking about and discussing, even if we know that some of them are not a short-term strategy, if that makes sense. So I'm just wondering if we kind of shift them into the other section, if we decide that they're not a short-term conversation.
I think that's a nice way to start to do that, to start the conversation. I think it will depend on whether or not it's the will of the commission to, like, we haven't vetted them yet, but I think if the commission gets to the point where it says these are still viable things to consider, but we're just not ready yet, then yes, I think that's a good place to put them. And that might plant some seeds, which is really important. I just didn't want to get ahead of, like, yeah.
Okay.
I think that makes sense, and I would just suggest there's 2 reasons why we may not recommend something. One is it's not feasible to implement for the upcoming year, and the second is that we just haven't had time to really properly vet it.
Right.
And either of those reasons, we haven't really gotten to it. We're just going to put it off to the side, put it in an appendix, it's still out there for consideration, but we're not spending our time on it now.
Just a process question. So while we're kind of going through this list, we also have our subcommittee essentially doing the same thing?
Correct.
Okay.
Well, and it's a logistical, didn't want to wait for this conversation. I also think that what we're doing is a lot blunter than what the finance subcommittee is doing, and we'll be informed by that for sure. And it really is more related to, we have this meeting and what are we doing. At some point, there's going to have to be kind of a call to question phase. I think that's the December meeting, because that is on the 3rd. The report has to be turned around by the 15th. So just kind of acknowledging.
I wonder whether there's an opportunity to have sort of a section of recommendations for the General Assembly for legislative action that might impact, and recommendations to the field, right, to sort of, Oliver, I think you had mentioned this at the last meeting, set some targets. I do think one of the challenges, speaking as a former business manager and current school board member, like, it's really, really difficult to reduce staff at the local level. It's really, really difficult to impose a contract, to close a school. And oftentimes it feels like the blood is shed at the local level and there's no help, there's no support, there's no one publicly willing to say, we know this is hard and we also know it needs to happen. And I think the benefit of this body being able to set some targets, I think school board members and administrators would welcome that. Not just to give some sense of like, okay, this generally, we're on the right track here, but to get a little cover. Because the reason we're in the situation we're in is because it involves a lot of really hard trade-offs that upset people. I'm gonna go, Anne hasn't spoken in a while, and so we've been over.
No, I think in relation to that, I've watched the discussions locally. Local school boards are elected by their friends and neighbors. And to ask them to do something that is difficult and unpopular with their friends and neighbors is not really fair. The closer you get to local, the more personal it gets.
Very personal.
Yes. And we've actually had school board members resign because of the harassment their children took for decisions in the school board. I think if we decide that difficult decisions need to be made, the state is going to have to step up and carry that burden, either set up carrots and sticks to limit choices, to do something that gives some relief to those local schools. This is a statewide problem, and if we're going to ask sacrifices in some places, we're going to have to give them the cover they need.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's helpful for us to differentiate our recommendations from legislative action versus some recommendations at a school level, a local level. I also think it's really important as we have these conversations to acknowledge the challenges at the local level. And also the limitation around what's in their purview. We often hear the question, well, why did we make these changes if the community down the street doesn't also have to make these changes, right? And again, it's, definitely being responsible for the kids in your local community, but creating that shared responsibility for all Vermont kids. And with that comes very specific and consistent guardrails that are fit.
So one, I absolutely think this has to be a call to action. I think Nicole and I are completely in line. There needs to be some sort of a target that everybody can be working towards, and it needs to be a financial target. And I'm wondering if we take some of the concepts that we've talked about, sort of list them out as a menu of different options. particularly those that are at the, specifically those that can be levers that can be pulled at the local level. And the call to action would be say, listen, we need everybody to come in, below this target. And if you are unable to come in below this target, you need to be prepared to explain that how you've considered some of these options and have not taken these actions. And it's a sort of a subtle way of positioning people to say, listen, we're all in this together. We all need to make difficult choices, and you should be prepared to sort of account for why you are not making these difficult choices for the start of the legislative session. And then that becomes actually input that can come back to the legislative to try to tease out some of these nuances and separate what's really a nuance versus what's a difficult decision people aren't willing to make.
Who are they gonna have to justify that to, like a panel?
I think, some sort of a legislative panel, but if we put the concept out there now, if we telegraph to people now that, this is what we're recommending the legislature do, is ask you, well, if you come in above this target, to report back with this questionnaire, I think that will influence behavior.
I'm going to acknowledge that we may be getting into a discussion about a recommendation, which is really important to do, but maybe slightly further than we're ready. Go ahead, Jim.
So we've done that before, Oliver. We had the 2-vote mandate. We've done this before. We've had this exercise before. And I actually would say that I think we're looking at this perhaps the wrong way, Nicole. I disagree that I heard that many years ago in the State House that local school boards couldn't do it. They couldn't do this on their own. They needed the state to come in and step in and mandate it. And I actually think the system needs updating. That's what I said earlier. I think the education finance system hasn't been updated in many years. And that's the funding issue. We could have given targets incredible cuts, I think, this past year, and still we would have had property taxes going up at some level. And I think we're looking at trying to squeeze one end when the other end is not being even addressed. And so I think the education funding system needs to be equally addressed. And I think at some point, either we're talking about closing 50 or 100 schools, we got to be honest about that and have an honest conversation with those communities that, which 100 schools are we going to close? And have those conversations with those communities or not. But I think before we get there, I think we need to address the funding system inequities and problems and bring them up to speed to where they've not been addressed for a bunch of years. That's what I would say. I mean, I think that we've been around here long enough, and there are system problems that before you then direct school boards to do, but I think they've really done a good job at it. I don't think any school board is unnecessarily spending money, and or superintendents are suggesting that they're spending money unnecessarily. I do think there are problems with the education funding system that need to be first put in place before we then look at the other side.
We're definitely in discussing ideas mode, so I think we should move. I also just want to reiterate, I don't believe the solution lies in any one of them, and I also don't know that they are rank ordered like this one first and this one. I actually think it's what can be implemented right away.
I think that's right, Megan. I think even in your description around the education finance system, you talked about assumptions around scale. Right? And I think that's important that we've talked about this funding formula, structure, as tax reform, right? All of those pieces together to make this system whole and sustainable.
And I think I'm sorry, the reasons that, for me, an important reason to harp on that is so that we're really clear with the public that this is going to touch lots of things and they're all hard. And our set of guiding principles is what needs to be how we vet them to make sure that it's not just hard, it's also the right thing for kids.
Yeah, we need to keep in mind that adjusting the system, that money is finite, we can't print it, and that, I've been told to tax the rich. The number I'm having been thrown out there is $74 million that would bring in. We put $100 million to buy down the tax rate this year to get it to where it is unacceptably high. And that's in new taxes and in one-time money. That isn't a solution. And to just say the general fund needs to pick this up, the general fund hasn't been able to adequately fund mental health and home health services. We have a hospital system that's in crisis, and the cost of healthcare is obviously in crisis. So there is a limit to how much money we can spend. What that limit is, I don't know, but there doesn't seem to be right now a whole lot of untapped money out there that we can bring in to just solve this and the other problems. And I think we should be very clear, there just isn't.
I think anybody has suggested that we find more money.
Yeah.
Yes, so you can decide not to offer a program, a constraint program that you've added when times are good.
So let's start with our list. And again, we are not right now discussing the merits of these as recommendations. We are trying to narrow our focus as a commission so that we know. And this, I actually think, will be instructive for the finance subcommittee, because if we can use this blunt metrics to say these things aren't going to be quick enough, it might make your analysis a little bit more focused as well. So skipping A, which is just overviewing this process that we will explain in our report how we chose to do this. B is remove non-educational expenses from the education fund, and there's several listed. There's been several more kind of brainstormed.
When we say universal school meals is mandated by the legislation, okay? I don't know that mental health or public health costs are. I think that's a decision schools are making if they're going to deal with the mental health issues, but is that mandated?
Because we already know that vast majority of the mental health services provided in schools are provided through special education, which is.
Okay, so special education is.
I think the question is, I think a better, more refined question than I asked to begin with is, are there some recommendations, theoretically, if we agree on them, that could be made relative to the education fund in this coming year? And I think Nicole's point of, it wouldn't be move it may be discussing whether or not something is viable.
I was just gonna suggest, can we break 4 in because there's short-term cost containment strategies, and then there's, funding movement or whatever we want to call it, right? So, B there, that is not a cost containment strategy. That is moving it.
Property tax relief.
Exactly, yeah. So I would create I think we need to separate those.
Or just change the title, right? Like, again, the title is pulled from the law, and I think we've already kind of acknowledged that it may not be a cost containment strategy, but it falls under the action this session.
Right. But the law requires cost containment, and then we can also supplement. So I think we need to have a category that says cost containment, and then a separate category for other things.
Yes, and I think this one would be, property tax relief, this would be finance, finance committee, yeah.
We had at least 3 in the finance subcommittee, right? We had cost containment, we had property tax relief, and then we had like revenue proposals, and there was a 4th that I'm forgetting. Maybe, or maybe there wasn't a 4th.
I think the 4th was data.
Data, yes.
Okay. So loosely using those, this would then be a property tax relief. And so is some portion of this is all I'm trying to get to, not each one of these, but some portion of this is potentially actionable in 2025.
Yes.
We're going to take political will.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh,
potentially actionable there.
Yes.
Doesn't mean we support it or not.
Okay.
I have a question for B4, is it still funding pre-K? This seems more of a programmatic recommendation.
Yeah, not knowing exactly what what the intention was with whoever.
Well, it says
was on the
remove
table.
non-educational expenses from the education fund, so in this case, it would mean you wouldn't pay for pre-K if there wasn't licensed teachers, it'd be done the same as regular preschool, which wasn't, what we talked about 10 years ago when we first passed the law, it's never changed.
But just because
Right.
somebody's not licensed doesn't mean they're not an educator.
That's not what we're talking about, we're saying, is this something that could be done this year?
Correct. We're not getting
Right.
yet to the merits of it. I think
Yeah.
Joey was just asking and clarifying the question.
That's what I was trying to do, is get a clarifying answer. It's not saying it's right or wrong, it's just saying that's what I think the point was there. Same with dual enrollment, it's not that it's right or wrong, is it something we could do this year? Remove it from ed fund expenses? Sure, we could. Should we? That's a further conversation.
Yeah, but I think when you're characterizing it as a non-education expense.
Right.
So that's I think the issue.
If that was instead rephrased to say, education fund,
Really getting at the appropriations, right, that we talked
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to me,
You're really talking about the
ed
state
fund
level.
use,
ed fund, maybe a better,
not, yeah. And some of these are educational, it's
Right.
just,
Right.
the decision-making that happens around them is happening at the state policy level as opposed to, so that it gets down to the philosophical, like what's the purpose of the ed.
Isn't it really that when the ed fund was created, these weren't there, and they've been added over time?
And what's the purpose of the ed fund? The purpose of the ed fund, in my view, we're gonna aggregate all the property tax revenues that we have collected across all municipalities and then disperse them back out in an equitable way. Because it's a self-funded,
It's not saying they're meritless or merit.
right, that it's not a good program, or
Right.
people are questioning, it's like, is this what property taxes should be paying for? Or is this a statewide program that statewide broad use taxes should be?
I hate to interrupt, but Elizabeth, I think, has got her hand up, and I know.
thank you, thank you, Jay.
Sorry, I just noticed it.
Thank you, Jay. Go ahead, Elizabeth. I should just say, Elizabeth and Jennifer, you might just want to unmute and bust the word out. I've been.
Okay. That's okay. No problem. So I just wanted to, I'm wondering if under B, where we have universal school meals, and it also says the mental health and other public costs under the same bullet item, I'm just wondering if we should separate those two as bullet items, because we may determine that further down the line, you know, there are some of these that are actionable right away, and maybe other pieces of it are not actionable immediately. And so keeping them separate might be helpful. And I'm only thinking that because we know from the data that we all try to collect that the mental health and other public health cost portion is really hard to tease out in our data, just because of the way we have all of our expenses coded. It's not an easy pull out of our data.
Yeah.
I think it's a worthy thing to look at later, but going to Secretary Saunders' concerns earlier about the data, it is a very challenging one, but I think it's one that we need to discuss because Vermont does this in a different way than other places do.
And it may be that if we reframe this recommendation as education fund use, and I think what I'm hearing is, should we decide, it's not necessarily this list of 1 through whatever, but the idea of looking at ed fund use is actionable by 2025.
Yes.
I think that's what I heard.
The one question I have is, are we, in many instances, it seems like we're shifting this from a statewide program to a local decision. So in other words, for universal school meals or dual enrollment or pre-K, I mean, so the local communities can decide that they'll fund that at the level they think is appropriate.
Potentially,
But
I mean, if that's the one that we recommend gets pulled out.
what did happen, right? So whereas I think teachers' retirement is a little different than the others. The others are really more programmatic resources that the state is that are important for a well-rounded education versus being able to provide funding for pensions. Just different.
There's two versions of remove, right? One is end, and then the other is move to the general fund.
So move to general fund and then some will move to local decisions. It seems like it. I guess that's what I'm trying to tease out.
I don't think we're saying any of the, we're not saying necessarily universal school meals should be removed, but that's a potentially actionable item for this upcoming legislative discussion.
Yeah, I sort of like the reframing of just general. I think what we're talking about here are the non-ed payment lines in the ed fund.
Yes.
Can those programs either be adjusted, shifted, like The answer to that is yes, right? Like from a general standpoint, any of those things could be talked about.
Or the same kind of discussion.
Yeah, exactly. So then the question is, getting into the details, what are the but can those lines be adjusted in the session? Yeah, for sure.
Well, they were. I mean, $75 million of new costs were added to the ed fund, right?
Right.
Let's
So yeah, so
change.
it's, I mean, so it's action, for sure. And it's just like, what is the recommended action?
Okay, so I'm gonna skip through 1 through 6, not because we're not gonna come back to them. Oh, it's 6 because I'm taking notes. And I I split things out based on, we will come back to any item on that list. Tuition caps for public tuition to independent schools, with an exception for private schools. Again, not the merits of it. Could this be done in this general assembly?
Just to clarify the question, I thought we were talking about tuition caps, period, not strictly for independent schools.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
I might have summarized that.
Well, I think there's 2 things where I put out the idea of talking about tuition caps, period. Now, I wasn't saying I recommended it. And then it was the independent, so I don't know what to be talking about.
Yeah, so, and there's also some information that needs to be corrected, because there was a comment made at the finance committee meeting suggesting that public schools only get paid AAT, and that's just not true. Public schools get paid whatever they announce. And then there's a true up or bill back mechanism as well. So the proposal that was put forth back on the 21st, it wasn't super clear whether it only applied, but the context implied it was only applicable to independent schools.
Yeah, I'm honestly not trying to shut down the conversation. We have to have it. The question right now, though, is this something that could be done for, like, could the General Assembly act on this in the 2025?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, and let me just,
Yeah, enact versus implementation, I think is the distinction.
Right.
So it could be enacted, and this is a cost containment strategy, right? If we're going by those categories from the.
so, and let me just jump in here, Megan, because I do agree that this is something that could be addressed in this legislative session, but I also agree that it shouldn't just be limited to independent schools. Because I think there needs to be parity.
Yeah. Okay. Compliance, so require independent schools receiving public dollars to comply with the same regulatory processes.
How is that cost containment? And I'll just give you an example. So the several independent schools have or are in the process of leaving VHI because it's the rate of increase is so, it's so expensive. And they're finding, not just reducing the growth rate, they're actually finding net savings by making a change. So strict reading of this would prohibit them from taking a very meaningful cost reduction action this year. So I question how this actually reduces cost.
I think the useful question, without going down to the discussion of it, which again, I'm not saying never, but not right now, but I think the question of, is this cost containment? Would this result in cost containment or property tax relief or any of the other things? I think that's a worthwhile question to ask.
The answer is no.
When only the assumption is not to approve.
Say that again, though, I didn't hear you.
I mean,
Only what?
it seems, I don't know when this was generated as a recommendation, but I'm wondering if part of the assumption there is that maybe not all meet that, so then not as many would be funded. I mean, it seems like that.
And if that's the case, then it could be cost containment. It would not be actionable in the 2025 session. Again, without the merits of whether or not it's worthwhile.
You guys have a process in place to.
Right,
compliance and accountability. Yeah.
Correct, and it would require new rulemaking and.
I agree, I think that one goes over
So I think
the, that's a future top conversation.
So, okay, it's not actionable. And I realize that technically the General Assembly can do anything. So when I say it's not actionable,
We're not making a recommendation for this year.
right.
For this
That, if someone else said it's enactable, then it could not cause.
Yeah, I think it's more of a programmatic consideration for education.
I don't know, public tuition dollars going out of state. Is it the same?
When we've discussed this in the past, and I don't want to get into detail, we've always said we would grandfather, if we ever did this, we would grandfather kids who were already in a school.
Which means it wouldn't, so even if it was enacted, it wouldn't do anything.
It would affect,
in the
it only
immediate.
would affect if I was an 8th grader, and I think the example the headmasters gave was Hanover High School as an example, New Hampshire, right?
So that's a,
Yeah.
that's a, that's a district.
Is that interstate district?
Well, there are other examples.
Yeah.
Unless other more.
You've got a whole bunch of folks up in the Northeast Kingdom, right, that their access to public education is across the river, right?
No, I understand. The question is this enactable for this year? It could be enacted if they want to do it.
You can do it, it just,
I think any of these things you can do, but it's, yeah.
Probably also more of an investment, there need to be investment in schools.
And I'm not quite sure it's well defined what we mean. I think people have different ideas of money going out of state, going across to Lancaster, New Hampshire's public high school is different than going to a public school in France, or a private school in France.
Yeah.
I think it's a more nuanced conversation.
And likely not to bring tax relief in 2025.
We have a building school.
Maybe. Okay, revise the non-homestead tax calculation. This is particularly ensure that non-homestead tax rates are not lower than homestead rates. It's also changed classification, so this applies to second homeowners and not small businesses.
So that's property tax relief, right?
So it's property tax relief.
Well, not on net, it's not.
Yeah, well,
I mean, that's fun.
So wait.
It's
So can I ask, I'm not exactly clear what this is proposing, is that the non-residential rate would float like the residential rate?
I think that's what it's, so right now, right, the non-homestead, so we got homestead, we got non-homestead. Homestead is owner occupied, non-homestead is everything else.
Yep.
So second home, but also commercial, industrial, all that.
Yep.
So the homestead rate moves with per pupil spending in the community, and the non-homestead rate is just set statewide. So we have a number of communities where the non-homestead rate is lower than the homestead rate. I think this is saying change that
So it floats.
that doesn't happen.
It does float.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just gonna throw out.
The non-homestead doesn't today.
Well, you're.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, but the proposal is to have it float, and I just want to caution,
But
there
not
was
so small businesses.
there was a specific reason why the grand list was bifurcated with Act 68. And it was to address the issue of all the foundations that have been created. If you do what's being suggested here, you're basically recreating the incentive to set up foundations again.
Well, when we did this, the homestead rate was lower than the non-homestead rate. And we knew that someday they would cross because school spending was going up at a faster rate. And they crossed in Plainfield 15 years ago. They crossed in Stowe last year and they're a little upset. But I think we've reached the point where enough of them, but what would result of doing that, I have no idea.
So again, we're discussing the merits, super important, but is this something that could be action? I'm sort of looking at the tax commissioner.
I think you could pass the policy, right? It would get baked into the yields, it would, I mean, it would be no weirder than all of the other yield and homestead rate setting that happens in the timeline today.
And then to your point, it's not necessary, I think where you were going is, it's not necessarily property tax relief.
It is not property tax.
So
relief.
does it fall in any one of the four categories that the
I
subcommittee?
mean, I would call it like funding formula change, right? But I mean, the amount of property taxes paid statewide will remain the same.
That's right.
Yeah,
Well, say it again.
It's homestead property.
Yes, correct.
That's what I should have said, right?
Yeah, but it's gonna lead to greater inequity because I can predict what Stowe's gonna do is they're gonna set up a private foundation and they're gonna go around all the second homeowners.
We can come back to it, we can come back to the merits.
Yeah.
Right now, we're trying to figure out what we're gonna talk about and not. And the commission may not, right?
The non-homestead also includes all the subsidized housing we're building. and they cannot raise their rents, that there were some adjustments looked at this year that would have raised that section more than significantly more.
All worthwhile discussion when we get to merits.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Tie excess spending threshold to cost drivers.
Can we explain how that was?
Yeah.
I don't understand totally what it's saying. So like if your insurance goes to a certain amount,
No, if like your staff to student ratio is out of bounds, you're more likely to trigger the penalty. I think that's what I'm
Yes.
understanding.
Okay.
The excess cost of maintaining a higher or lower ratio would be subject to the penalty or,
I don't know how you
tuition pay.
differentiate.
so like if something's happening.
You can do it for this coming.
Okay, then that's our answer.
Yes, yeah, it's complicated.
It would
Could
be,
not be enacted in.
We were saying it could not be enacted?
Maybe I'm wrong, I believe, I thought that's what you were saying.
it could be enacted, whether or not it could be implemented in time to impact budgets that are currently being built, right? So if boards are completing their budgets by the end of December, we haven't done any kind of
Okay, so
analysis.
But there is an excess spending threshold. in place.
There is right now, it's based on spending per equalized people.
You're saying like different metrics would trigger, so like if other metrics, not necessarily per pupil spending, start to get out of whack based on state definitions, that would trigger it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think
gotcha.
we
Yeah, it's
have,
the same tuition, personnel, facilities, all those.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay.
we have to come to grips with the fact that a lot of the energy goes to the smallest districts and high ed spending for equalized people and lack of scale. And yes, that's an area we need to look at, but we have a lot of larger districts who run very small classes. Who pay their employees much higher. And so the overall hit on the ed fund is arguably much greater in districts that never even have to think about the excess spending threshold. Because they have scale, they're never gonna come up against it. So I do think being more strategic about ensuring that all districts are responsive to the cost suppression, not just those that are small.
So I got confused, those, I thought you said that could be enacted, but then I thought maybe you wrote down cannot be enacted.
I thought she was saying could not be, and then I rephrased what I wrote and said it could be enacted, but would not be implemented.
Would not be responsibly implemented.
So it may not be something that's worth us talking about, I think, for these December recommendations.
Well, I mean, I think if you want it adopted this session to
For
go
a
into
future-
effect for next
yes,
year.
we're gonna talk
we do
about it
need to
now.
talk about it.
Yeah, agreed.
I think this puts parameters on all districts and gives us something that we have to work towards.
Yes, okay. So I've got could be enacted, not implemented in time to impact budgets, but it's not crossed off the talk about it list yet.
I'm not necessarily advocating for saying it should be implemented this year, but I would also flag, like, one of the elements of the excess spending penalty is reducing sort of the challenging incentive that exists with the funding formula today, where the districts that are, higher spending get the cheaper money, and the excess spending penalty helps that. So, it may not change a district's budget if it were implemented this year, but if it's going to be implemented against state standards, where the state says your district is out of line with these standards, and then the tax rate is higher in that community, like that does have property tax relief for the other communities that are by these state standards not out of line.
Yes.
Again, I'm not saying it should be done, I'm just saying it could have an
When
impact.
school boards are presenting a budget and to their community and saying, this is our projection in terms of tax impact, having knowledge of a radical change in the excess spending penalty is gonna be important to
Yeah,
report
that's
them.
fair.
So but I don't think should be off the table to say, we're gonna set some targets, some goals, here are the areas you should be looking at.
Yeah.
And by the way, one of the things that's on the menu of options for the legislature to consider is these excess spending, more targeted use of the excess spending. I don't think we could implement it for 26, but it doesn't hurt to put it out there as a possibility.
It wouldn't be fair.
No.
People, as you said, are voting on a budget based on an understanding that this is what our projected tax rate is, and then to move the goalpost
Right.
is not fair.
But for the future, it's an accountability measure for schools to look at.
Yeah, as we move up into the following budget.
Yes.
Where-
So we have jump starting the BOCES process with a caveat that I think is warranted about be aware that we're not creating additional bureaucracies. For example, if you have scale, you don't necessarily need a BOCES. That's my paraphrasing. Is that something that's actionable, or is that more of a context setting thing? Like, we already have this law, let's let it implement.
I mean, it's, I would say investing in the implementation and making it happen faster. I would say it's probably, so it's easily actionable. I'm not sure if there's any cost savings there, because what it really requires is people.
Yeah, and the idea that you would lift a BOCES structure and be able to serve students in a year is pretty.
That's a long term, right?
Yeah, okay. Thoughtful recommendations about achieving scale. It's one of our core things we have to do.
Vermont doesn't have scale. That's our biggest problem.
Correct. Well, yes.
No, I
agree.
If Vermont was a school, it would be a small school.
Yes, oh yeah. But that goes back to that, like, some things are totally true and some things are a little bit true, but all of it, for me, this is like the crux of one of our, policy area recommendations. And so what could be actionable this year? I don't know.
Well, I mean, you have to more clearly define what it is, actual item, so you would say, do we mandate class sizes?
Yeah, that was
That's
one
how
of
you
the
would choose
class
it.
size minimums. Yeah.
Again, I don't see that being.
Well, so we have there is a list, there is a suggestion here that is, class size recommendations with, exceptions for rurality.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure what that looks like.
Oh, it's right there. Sorry, getting lost in my own document. So I guess, again, back to, could we implement class size minimums? At this stage, I'm thinking specifically about where we are in the budget process right now.
But I think it falls into that category of things that you can't implement for FY '26, but are things that the legislature can implement.
Correct. You can enact, but not necessarily.
I think I've only got 4 kindergartners, and I have a class requirement size of 10. What?
You would open up the other 2 policy areas, which are delivery model, which is impacted by governance, because you would ask yourself, am I one of the schools that cannot, because there's no one around me for miles, merge, or am I in one of the schools? And that's only one option. There's lots of different ways that you could address that.
We'll combine the kindergarten through 5th grade, but I have a.
And then you got to ask yourselves whether or not that's quality education. Exactly. So I think that.
K-1, 2, pre-KK. I'm saying those are easy things to do.
Those are easy.
Correct. Correct.
Great, your test scores.
So.
Much to the detriment of many of those kids.
But again, the legislature could enact this, but it wouldn't be implemented by the next budget season. Provide statewide curriculum resources to decrease local duplicative costs. So I think that's one of the things that, I don't know if you had said it, but just.
For the first time in 30 years, there's a lot of people out there that are interested.
Yeah.
Yes.
What we've been hearing a lot through the listen and our tour is around the cost of time also. So not just the cost around purchasing and achieving economies of scale and getting the right pricing, but just the amount of time on central office staff and principals and doing the research.
I would say this goes into our long-term strategy. This is not a.
This is an age-old thing, and people are always calling for that, as long as you're using the curriculum that we have.
As long as I like your recommendation, I like it.
That's how it always is, right?
Everybody else should be using the curriculum that we have. So that, I think there's merit in exploring that, but there's not going to be any immediate savings for FY '26.
Address potential incentives in the current funding formula. Maybe we've talked about this already.
Yeah, I think that's a discuss in the upcoming session, but you're not gonna change the funding formula for fiscal year 26.
Well, you could. Some of the things I mentioned, you know, the home site value over 400,000 that Andy mentioned once, but I'm trying to blank on that. There are ways to structure the funding system soon, enact it in January, for example, and it would hit town meeting day with applause, perhaps.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I'm just use the terminology a little different because I would talk about that as like property tax credit reform, but fair point. Yeah, you could adjust house site value this session.
It has to be paid for somehow, right? I mean, at the end of the day.
The tax rate would go up on the folks that aren't income sensitized.
Yep, we're getting to merits.
Nice
Yeah.
self-reporting system.
Reference-based pricing, is that something that could be?
I would say that that is out of the purview of either education or ways and means, that's healthcare. I assume that's what we're referring to.
Oh, I mean, I had a little exchange with Jeff Fan about this. I think Beehive has already filed their rates for 26. I think certainly healthcare, as a state is an issue, and we could add our voices along with many others in the education community, talking about the need for more.
Yeah, I didn't mention this in the email, but that you are exchanged, but the DI could actually submit for a mid-year rate adjustment if this is enacted. So.
Right. I just, would the hospitals have to do it for schools only or for everybody? It just.
That's, you know, again, we're getting merits. In Montana, they did it for state employees and for school employees. And so, 50 million, whatever the number was. Oregon's done it only 24 hospitals. There are ways to do it. So I think there are ways to at least recommend it, Peter, that, okay, look into it and enact it.
Is it within, I'm thinking of what you just said, Peter, is it, I think you said it's out of the purview of the legislature.
I say out of the purview of sort of the two committees that deal with these issues. It's really
I see.
a healthcare thing, and just as an aside, states have turned to this or turned away from it. Montana being particular, because it ends up just being a caution to those of us who are privately paying on the exchange.
You have to be sure that they're the private insurance.
So I have a question about whether or not that's enactable in this year.
It's enactable, it's just that it's an implementation issue.
Yes.
Yeah, and how does this commission even discuss the merits? Again, we don't have the background in that policy. I don't feel comfortable weighing in on the merits of that kind of change.
The conversation's going to happen anyway.
Yeah, sure, yes.
Yeah.
Allowable growth excess spending targets applicable to both public and private schools. We've sort of talked about this. I mean, there's a difference between recommendations to school districts where targets could be recommended and the General Assembly enacting targets after budgets have been passed is generally not super helpful.
Not great, no. But I think if we could, on this one, if we could endeavor to have some sort of a recommendation to school districts, like a target, like, hey, can we all try to keep our growth below this on a per pupil basis?
I just think that needs to be coupled with specific ways to do that, because again, a couple things, people can ignore a letter.
And some,
especially if crowds start to show up at their meetings saying, how dare you, this is gonna include lots of students. And I guess my concern with allowable growth is that, because that was already state policy and it was abandoned, is it bakes in a lot of the inequities that currently exist in the system. And so if you're already a low spender, slash your budget just to get it past this past year, like our friends in Barry did, you know, your allowable growth now is the same as an allowable growth for a district that was to be, if the exercises could be done, sure. I would hope that even within our targets, we talk about, equitable implementation and looking at.
Well, to be clear, the proposal was not to have a uniform target. It was
Each district had its.
a graduated target based on how far you were from the. Yeah, exactly. So the higher spending you already are, the lower allowable growth you have.
But again, if you're, that punishes the small district, because you're higher
Yes, anyway, we're
spending.
getting
So
You don't have to scale.
I wrote, this could be part of the call to action, if we decide that it's an actionable thing. We decide that it's a.
I'm positioning it as something we could do as part of the call to action, so it's not a hard thing, but then to Nicole's point, I think it does need to be coupled, not necessarily with mandates, but with some options to consider and an expectation that, you know, if your spending goes above this threshold, you probably should have some good answers to these questions, and there may be perfectly good answers to those questions.
Community members can ask you these questions when you're out presenting your budgets.
I'm leaving it at call to action, and because I want to draw this connection every time, there are some districts who have thoughtful recommendations about changes in delivery model, and the governance structure prevents them from doing that, and a cap by itself might force a district into making cuts where they shouldn't be made, or perhaps in program elimination to hold on to something that's meaningful for whatever reason. Again, now I'm getting into merits, which I said not to. I meant to just say, this is an example of why those three things make all this stuff more complicated. But I have this down as part of the call to action. Same thing for the requirement for a supermajority vote.
Yes.
Although that would require legislative action to develop a waiver or review mechanism for districts to opt out of unfunded mandates. It feels like it would take a long time to figure out or come to agreement on what is an unfunded mandate.
We're currently collecting that information. We're trying to start with what we understand of the unfunded mandates and dividing that in terms of those that have a cost impact, a potential cost impact, and those that are hard to quantify. So we're starting there, and we'll expect to get a lot of feedback around that. The other question I have is something that is unique about Vermont's budgeting cycle is that we start early and end early. And so being new to Vermont, this will be my first town meeting day, is there any opportunity to adjust that timeline so that town meeting day would be later?
We've had conversations about that, Zoe, for decades. I think you should go out publicly and say that. Because when I said that, I used to be terrible with that.
Okay, let me tell you two big things.
Calendar's one.
Agreement notices, and contractual obligations, that's the biggest one, and that typically is April 15th, is that right?
Give or take.
So if you don't have a budget by April 15th,
That's
the contracts say you have to provide a reduction in force notice to your employees.
And that's in the law.
So that can be modified, but I'm not sure there'd be a lot of support for that.
A couple districts did that, Zoe, just to be clear.
Yeah, a couple
Essex, Westford did that. There's 2 or 3 that did do that. They thought to give them better time to see the information.
You have more information.
And made it a little bit more realistic, but a lot haven't. It's the reasons that.
And you gamble for that very reason. So it is possible to do it. The district, depending on when it's moved, the district would still have to make an educated guess as to what might happen and either issue or non-issue notices. And it's a gamble, but it's not impossible.
But a lot has changed since Act 46 with a lot of consolidation. Most districts have moved to Australian ballot voting now. I think it's probably time to revisit that conversation.
There's much more Australian ballot. I mean, it used to be very common vote from the floor. It's a lot less common now.
But we also saw a lot of record numbers go down.
No, I agree. I'm just saying, yeah.
Okay, we are right at the end of our discussion time. And so I'm trying to just look ahead. We have a steering group meeting next, we just said when it was. Next week, okay. It feels like, I feel like I could turn some sort of the context introduction portion of this report back out to folks just to get some early feedback on that part of it. I don't know what I would be writing down in terms of any of these recommendations or things like that, and that's, I think, gonna need more conversation. But what I will do is make an attempt to summarize the pieces that are contextual, kind of the body of the report. Everything that I am generating is not solid until the commission approves it. I will have that in time for the steering group to take a first pass at it, but when I send it to the steering group, it'll go to the full commission, and obviously we'll take the input of the full commission. And then, so the steering group is the 14th, the 18th is the finance subcommittee, which will be another round that will shape the recommendations, and then I think we come to December 3rd, and that will be the call to question point.
What is it, the third or the second?
Well, I keep saying
Second or
third.
Monday.
It's the second. I don't know why I keep saying the third. 8:30, I think is what I have. Okay.
Do we know where we are in December 2nd?
Yes, we are, we do now. We are in Middlebury at Addison Central. Exactly where, I don't know yet, but we are in Addison Central. And speaking of that, appreciate VSA for doing another push to superintendents, and we won't release this until we are sure, but we may have our locations up through April, which will be a lot easier than the quick turnaround that we've been doing. So, but we will be in I assume Middlebury. We will be in Addison Central, so in Addison County for our December meeting. Any final things commission members would like to throw out? I realize that conversation was a little all over the place.
Just back on the tuition, I just want to, the one that has to do with capping tuition, I'm not sure where we landed on that part. So we're saying the recommendation to be considered is to cap tuition in both independent and public schools.
So my notes, I wrote, hold on, let me find it. Well, I just made an edit that says that tuition caps would apply to both.
Okay.
And then in terms of feasibility, I have, yes, cost containment could be enacted in the 2025 session, likely not in place for the 2026 budget. That's the note I took on that.
And I'm not sure, I guess the question of the people who proposed that, was that the intent that it applied to everybody or just?
I think we can probably get to that one more. Actually, talking through it. Okay. We're actually early, and so this is our second opportunity for public comment. Okay, we have one in the room. So I'm gonna go in the room first. Folks on the screen who are interested in giving public comment, if you wanna just start by raising your hand or turning your camera on, and I will alternate. Start within the room.
Well, having been a school board chairman for 11 years, I can appreciate the discussion that occurred over here today.
I'm sorry, would you mind introducing yourself for us? Would you introduce yourself for us?
Oh, my name is Jay Gall. I served on the Sister Valley Union High School District and the end of this video. It was a very involved participant in the 46, which, by the way, I might add, despite the opinion at the time, we were able to cherry pick Act 46 and make it, pretty good. But that's another story. Anyway, the comment I wanted to make was, I was encouraged as a former school board member to hear the discussion about funding being affected by actions taken by the legislature and so forth. Because, oftentimes school board members find themselves in a position of having to deal with issues that are beyond their ability to control. And so they struggle, I can vouch for that, to try to include those consequences, those financial consequences into the budget. And I just wanted to point out too, that it's not just legislative actions that cause school boards financial grief. I'll point out one in particular. student assessment, the aspect contract that we had to do student assessment was actually amended 3 times within a 2-year period, the last 2-year period. It actually came to $1,896,000. When a decision was made to switch to Cognia, state entered into 2 contracts, and I have copies of both of them. I was quite startled to find that the 2 contracts were added together into $17,516,285. Now, Cognia Brace, that was actually out to 2027. The contract drags out to 2027. But Cognia Brace it down by a year. In year 1, the cost of assessment with Cognia was $3,330,933. In year 2, it was $3,104,499. So a grand total for the same 2-year period that aspect was serving our schools or assessing our schools. The Cognia contract increased our cost of student assessment by $9,305,858. So this is a decision that's not necessarily mandated by the Vermont legislature, other than the fact that we are required by the federal government to assess student performance. But this decision was made to go from this aspect to Cognia. And the only reason that I seem to have uncovered is that it's an opinion that Cognia includes more diversity, equity, and inclusion in their assessment procedures. Which I find kind of ironic in a way, because if you do background research on Cognia, one of its school commissioners got himself in a lot of trouble with the State Department, United States State Department, because he was in charge of, he was the general director of all Saudi Arabian schools and Muslim schools in the United States. And anyway, he was under investigation by the State Department for those schools located in the United States that are actually including anti-Semitism in their curriculum. And so that created quite a stir. I can give you more details to it, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. But just that one decision increased our assessment by over $5 million. You know, and that was a decision that came from somewhere. And I wasn't aware that aspect was discriminated against our students. The information. And one last comment with Mr. Francis is over here. I was asked simply before we look at a suggestion to close 100 schools. I'd like to know what actual information you have that verifies the fact that closing schools would save money.
Not, in fact, it's au contraire. I agree with you.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah. It's Jeff Bannon.
Jeff Bannon, not Francis. For Jeff Francis. Appreciate that. I'm not, just to be very clear, I was.
I got the first name right.
Yeah, you did. Thank you. I'm not proposing closing 100 schools. I'm just saying at some point that you start tweaking all these ways, that's the effect. I don't appreciate it, don't want it, but I think if you're gonna be honest with school districts, then be honest with them. I'm not suggesting we go there.
So I'm not seeing any hands at the moment on the screen.
I couldn't imagine adding anything to this conversation.
Okay, so
Can I use any remainder time to talk about tonight?
I was just going to turn to that, yes.
Sorry, thank you, Chair.
No, thank you. So we have first some logistics. We are at the St. Albans Town Educational Center, which is take a right and it's down the road just a little bit. We'll be in the library. Go in the main entrance is what I understand, and that's where we will be set up. We do start at 5. One thing that I know I wanted to ask this time around that we did not do, and we will still acknowledge the challenges of being hybrid. We know that we will likely have virtual only sessions, so even this will not likely be perfect, but I would love to have a member of the commission volunteer to run a breakout room, for lack of a better word. That is one thing that the folks on the screen couldn't really do at all last time. I think a couple people did, you know, raise their hand to share, to react to the questions, but I'll say this again in front of whoever is with us this evening, but what we would do is have one breakout room available for those who want to comment, and they would be moved into the breakout room, and I'm going to ask for a volunteer from the commission to facilitate that. Those that really just want to listen to the conversation that's happening in the room, good, bad, and indifferent, because it won't be perfect, will be able to stay in the main room. So I'm going to pause, and I would love a volunteer. Thank you, Peter, appreciate it. What else? Committee members, things that we did last time that we should tweak? People have thoughts. We did not really change the agenda.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to bring it up, is there, did people, everything I heard the last time went really well, except for the exception of people having trouble that were on. So we don't have a consultant yet, so I'm assuming we're gonna try to go the same way we did last time. Just wonder if people want to change it, that's why.
And we've got a different physical space.
Yeah, space will be more conducive because people will be at tables, and I think that by itself will make a big difference.
Yeah. That was the only thing I think that was missing, otherwise I think it was.
Yeah. Okay. There were a couple typos in the slides that I have fixed.
I blame that on the consultant.
Yes, it's the fault of the.
We paid for that?
Okay. I believe that we are adjourned.
You don't know how to get there, head up towards the interstate. Yeah. And it's right on the left-hand side.
Is it walkable or is that not a good idea?
It's less than 10 minutes. It's not too long walks.
Yeah.
It's in the high school,
No,
Grade school.
oh, so it's that, all right.
Yeah, it's in Alva City, it's right out,